Sego, if you like what we're doing here, if you support the show and you want to give support to the show, you can do so by going to patreon.com/let's talk native. And if you do so, we'll provide you some exclusive content and some things that others aren't going to get when you get it. So support us by going to Patreon. Yahweh.
Let's Talk Native is produced at the LTN Studios on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. We break all the rules for Native media by peeling back the layers of assimilation and indoctrination. No prayers, no buffalo speeches, and no spirituality shows. While this podcast does not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do take a tough look at history, oppression, and our survival. But the real goal here is to bring our people together by breaking down what separates us. So, welcome to Let's Talk Native with John Kane.
So everyone, welcome to Let's Talk Native. No guest today, just me. There's just so much to unravel because of everything that's going on in the United States. I mean, the last show that I did with Regan in New York, it opened up with me just a genuine, fit of laughter. I couldn't stop laughing, and I know that sounds, maybe it's offensive to some people, but when I said that the entire world is laughing at what's happening in the United States, I'm a part of that entire world that's laughing, because this has been building. Everything that we are witnessing now, both on the denial side and on the hyperbole side, it's so much of it's gamesmanship, and so much of it just really exists to the detriment of everybody. And I don't mean just Americans and U.S. citizens. I mean, there are a lot of people that are affected by the chaos that's kind of ensuing. So we'll get into it a little bit, and I'm going to talk specifically about democracy. But first, let me. I posted a video on my Facebook group page, a video that was shot by a Facebook friend from 8 years ago when I Don't Know More was a thing. And Matt Hill and we had gone to the Galleria Mall in the suburb of Buffalo, which is actually in Cheektowaga, and we were going to participate in what was a commonplace thing happening during the height of the I Don't Know More movement, which was these flash mob round dances, and they were taking place oftentimes in malls or in large public places. Some of them were huge. I mean, in places on the Canadian side and on the U.S. side, Mall of America and Edmonton, all these places. Some of these things were huge. Well, the Galleria Mall in Buffalo or Cheektowaga isn't that big a place, but it's got a pretty good space in the center. And so we went there. We're actually going to another event after that. We figured, we'll stop in there. These things will only last a few minutes long. We'll stop in there. So we showed up, and they were set up in an area that's a real open space, and it's got an open access, stairway or balcony all the way around it. It was a very large round dance. When you watch the video, you don't get a sense for how big the circle was, the dance, because it's so far back away from where the singers are. But as the singers had started, one of the things that Matt and I had observed was the Paul Blart, the mall cop, was basically really agitated, and he actually went over and tried to confront one of the little kids who was part of the group singing in the center of this round dance. So Matt and I decided we weren't going to dance. We were going to go inside the circle, and we were going to try to ensure that this guy or anybody else wasn't going to interfere with what they're doing. Now, keep in mind, it's called a flash mob round dance. For those of you who aren't familiar, these don't last that long. I mean, it's usually, it grows until you have, a critical mass of people dancing in the circle. And then it ends. I mean, it's just to make a statement. And of course, there are people with banners and signs and that kind of stuff. But so anyway, we get inside, and I keep kind of walking in between the mall cop and the singers. And I actually asked him if we are gonna have a problem, and then he said, "Yeah, you're right. You're gonna have an effing problem." He goes, "You guys are all trespassing." And I said, "All right then." So at that point, I took off my jacket and I'm thinking this could get interesting. Well, sure enough, a bunch of cops show up, and I run interference between the cops and the singers, and it turns into a bit of a conflict. So you can see it all in the video. But what's more important than just the idea that cops came to shut this thing down, and more important than me actually getting involved in a little bit of a physical altercation with the cops, was the idea that I could actually reason with him and have a conversation. I mean, when a lot of these videos, and there's a bunch on YouTube, and it says, Cheektowaga police attack, I don't know, more round dance, or attack at Galleria Mall. There's all kinds of stuff. You can find it on YouTube. This video that I reposted was really good because it's an overview. You can see everything that's kind of played out. It's kind of off in the distance, but you can see it pretty accurately. But the way a lot of people were characterizing it was that the police attacked. And the reality is they didn't. They were going to. And they had, a couple of the other suburban police departments, backing them up. And there was a line of cars outside. But I was actually, in spite of the fact that my altercation with this police officer started out a little rough and ugly, we were able to reason with each other. And I actually talked him down. And I think that's the whole point. Look, we live in a time where we're seeing conflict that can be sparked out of almost nothing. And in this situation, I felt pretty strongly about not letting the cops interfere with what was transpiring. But the thing that I explained to him is we're going to be gone here in a minute. Matt basically told the cop that you're going to have far much more time invested in paperwork than you are in anything going on here. It's going to take more paperwork than time to do with your paperwork than it's going to take for this thing to be over. And after we went back and forth, and of course, I got to give a lot of credit to not just Matt and I, but a lot of other people who stood there. A lot of women who came with their cell phones to make sure that it was all captured on video, because that does matter. I mean, it does affect the psyche of the police officers, knowing that whatever they're going to do is going to be captured and it's going to be plastered all over, YouTube, Facebook, whatever. But to the credit of the police officers, the one in particular that was in charge, they ended up doing the right thing, and nobody was charged with anything. The round dance happened, and it was pretty phenomenal. In fact, as we were backed up right against the singers. The singer started getting louder, hitting the drums harder, going louder and louder and louder, and then it builds up to a crescendo, and then it's all over. And Matt and I continued on our way. But I just think if you get a chance to watch a video, I don't encourage people to get physical with a police officer, and I didn't mean to. In fact, until I saw the video, I didn't realize that I actually had gotten as physical as I had. But he grabbed me, and I kind of did the swim move and got him off of grabbing a hold of me. At one point, when he tried to go around me, he started reaching down to his belt for his pepper spray, and I leaned in and I suggested that wasn't a good idea when you consider that it was hundreds, at least 500 people were there, maybe closer to 1,000. I don't know, but I just told him that it was a bad idea and that it was unnecessary. And much to my surprise, I will say, he ultimately agreed, and we all went our way. But it is a good example about resistance, but with diplomacy. And so I do encourage people to take a look at the video, and you make your own judgments. I mean, how right I was, how wrong I was, or whatever. But I did keep those police officers from shutting down our flash mob round dance 8 years ago at the Galleria Mall, and that anniversary of that was just a couple of days ago. So that's why I'm wearing my I Don't Know More shirt today. So, all right. So here's what I wanted to talk about today. With all of the clamor about the attack on the U.S. democracy, and this is part of the hyperbole I'm talking about. When I listen to people talk about the Capitol as some sort of temple of, or sacred, space or whatever else, look, it's a freaking building. And when people want to talk about this temple of democracy, we need to analyze a little bit more what democracy is. Because I'm going to flat out say it. Democracy it promotes racism. Because democracy at its core is about majority rule. So in the United States, with 62% of the population being white, and I know people are going, oh, I knew you were going to go racist on this thing. Look, if racism wasn't a thing in the United States, then you wouldn't walk into the halls of Congress and see it disproportionately white. You wouldn't walk into a prison and see it disproportionately black. You wouldn't look at the wealthiest people in the world in the United States and see that those are disproportionately white. The CEOs of major corporations, that they're all disproportionately white. If that didn't exist, if there was more racial equity, I mean, but even if there was racial equity, keep in mind, you would still have 62% of Congress being white. There would be essentially almost no Native people in any as Congress people, because we are less than 0.5% of the U.S. population. So if you're going to look at democracy in terms of what it is, which is this idea that a majority makes rules, for one thing, that's not what the United States exactly is, because the founding fathers of the United States didn't want a democracy. Why? Because they were a bunch of elite white guys, white men, not just white guys, white men. They weren't interested in true democracy. For one thing, women, which at this point I think are may even be more than 50% of the U.S. population, they only got the right to vote or participate or own land, 100 years or 150 years ago or so. I mean, so it wasn't set up to be a democracy. It was about white people with power. And the founding fathers of the United States, although they would aspire to have an educated and a well-informed electorate, they knew that's not what they had. And the electorate they were talking about were other white people. It wasn't black people, it wasn't brown people, it wasn't Native people, and it sure as hell wasn't women. So what was set up in these sacred spaces, these buildings, was not democracy. And part of the reason that some of the founding fathers were against this idea of democracy because they were afraid of mob rule. How ironic is that? Because if you only leave power in the biggest mob, then that mob is susceptible to false idolatry. I mean, and to these guys like a Donald Trump. Anybody who can propagandize, that's how you end up with some of these authoritarian leaders that are put into place by populism, because democracy promotes populism. And look, when we can talk about trying to make sure that the minority is not oppressed by the majority, when you're constantly beating that drumbeat of democracy, that's what you're talking about. You're talking about the majority ruling over the minority. Now, the U.S. Constitution is supposed to protect the weak, and when I say weak, it means protect the weak by numbers. It's supposed to protect the minority, and of course, it didn't, because the very guys who were talking about all men are created equal and liberty and justice for all, most of those guys were slaveholders. So even as they were spewing this stuff, they didn't take that stuff to its literal definition. They had already created this idea that the people that they were talking about, the democracy that they were talking about, were among white people, white men in particular. And so I think for people to understand some of the downfalls that exist in the United States, is it really finds some of its root in this idea that a mob or the largest group gets to rule over the smallest group. See, here's the problem with this idea that elections solve problems. When you go into an election, you realize, okay, you have difference of opinions that are going to be expressed, and you're going to cast a ballot for this position over this position, or vice versa. But if you go into it with the idea, okay, if somebody's initiative prevails in an election, then I concede to that initiative. That I then that will determine the consensus of the American people. That's not what exists in the United States. I mean, if you've got 50% of the United States, and you don't, but if it was a 50-50 split, right and left, then you would think that an election would resolve some of that, but it doesn't. What it does is it polarizes them even more. And everything that you try to do to try to, eliminate oppression or abuse polarizes people even more. And look, clearly the founding fathers of the United States would cast out certain people. Native people, which there was actually more Native people than there were white people on this continent at one time. We would never be included in their governance. In fact, the Constitution refers to us as being excluded for apportionment or representation and all other stuff. So we were clearly not a part of it. Black people would be counted for apportionment, but they wouldn't be able to vote, because they were enslaved. They were owned, and they were considered property. In fact, there was probably a period of time in the United States that there may have actually been more people enslaved, especially in the southern states, than there were more people enslaved than there were people who were enslaving. So these guys, I mean, you take Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, only one of them, but they had more than one slave. So this wasn't about democracy. Slaves didn't get a chance to voice their opinions. They were property. They weren't human beings as far as the founding fathers of the United States were concerned. And even as they shaped this so-called representative republic or democratic republic or whatever you want to call it, you have to keep in mind that it still wasn't democratic. There's a disproportionate amount of power that goes to were the slaveholding states. And today, even as you look at the U.S. Senate, the U.S. Senate has a disproportionate amount of power to rural southern states. I mean, if you've got a 50-50 Senate like it looks like the United States is going into here, those 50% represent the Republicans, don't represent 50% of the population. In fact, it's not even that close. It's disproportionate. Why? Because two senators per state. Every state gets 2 senators, regardless of whether it's Vermont or North Dakota or whether it's California or New York. So you end up with only 50 senators, 48 plus 2 independents, representing a bigger population than the 50 Republican senators. So that's not democratic in any way, shape, or form. And of course, that's on the Senate side. On the House side, due to things like gerrymandering and the manipulation of voter districts and packing a certain amount of minority black people or whatever into one group, you can limit the amount of congressional representation to defy the population. I mean, so what you have is, when you look at elections, you can see that there are more Democratic votes cast even in years that the Republicans have gained House members. Well, how does that work? Well, it's not just because a certain district overwhelmingly, or I guess it is, a certain district overwhelmingly votes Democratic, because they've all been packed in there. They're not spread across. They manipulate what the shape of the district looks like, so they can concentrate all Democrats or people they perceive as Democrats, like black people or whatever, into one district. So yeah, they're going to win that district, but they're going to win it by a large amount, and we will manipulate all the other districts so they can win perhaps not so marginally. So this is how the system has screwed up both the House and the Senate. So the entire legislative branch of the government. Now, that's not even talking about the Electoral College, which is another disproportionate anti-democratic system that gives power to states disproportionately, based on disproportionate from their population. So there's nothing that's democratic about it. And then even when you get into the system of governance, you have some of these rules, not even laws, but rules that, like filibuster, that disproportionately assist Republican states. because they don't have the population. They've already been disproportionately granted more seats than their population would otherwise dictate, and because the filibuster rules have changed over the years, where all somebody's got to say is, I oppose this piece of legislation advancing to the floor, it requires a supermajority for it even to advance. I mean, the legislation may be restricted to simple majority, but to advance it in the rules of the Senate chambers requires a supermajority to advance it, and that's how McConnell was able to stop all of Obama's court nominees, and stop basically every piece of legislation that he was able to determine would go to the Senate floor, and then. And so, because he was the Senate speaker, the majority speaker, and this is how the whole thing has been manipulated. And so, when I hear people talk about this, the mob going to the Capitol, where now it's up to 6 people who've perished, who've died as a result of this thing. When I hear it declared as an attack on democracy, no, it wasn't. Democracy wasn't attacked here. But here's the thing about democracy also. Democracy isn't just about majority rule. It's, especially in the United States, because you can actually win an election in the United States, especially the president of the United States, by not winning the popular vote. You can actually win an election without getting more than 50% of the vote. And in fact, Bill Clinton, when he beat George Bush, he beat him because a third party candidate, Ross Perot, had taken enough votes from the Republican. So Bill Clinton never reached the 50% threshold. So he wasn't elected by a majority. In fact, the majority of the votes were cast for somebody other than Bill Clinton. So I mean, this is the antithesis of democracy. I mean, there are countries in the world that if somebody doesn't get elected with a 50% majority, and there's some states that do this too, then there has to be a runoff between the final, and that's how Georgia ended up having this runoff election for the two U.S. senators, because no candidate had gotten over a 50% of the vote. So that's why. So some states will do it, but this is the lack of uniformity when it comes to the way elections are held in the United States. So again, when you consider that in the United States, 62% of the U.S. population is white, it's going to affect. Look, even the majority of Democrats are white. So it's not just that, whites are all Republicans and everybody else is, all the something else are Democrats. No, that's not. Even if you look at the Democratic Party, most of them are white. So if somebody gets advanced in the Democratic Party, they have got to pass through the white threshold. So even there, and anytime when we see like a civil rights bill pushed through, or something that protects the oppressed people, it takes white people to advance it. I mean, so whatever freedoms or protections that the minority does get, they get through the grace of white people. So I mean, that's the system. The only thing that a black person or a Native person or a Hispanic person is going to get is what the white people allow them to get, because they aren't protected, and they're never going to be the majority. Even they say by what are they saying, 2030 or something like that white people may drop below 50% of the U.S. population, but they're still going to be the largest single group. I mean, black people are only 12 or 13% of the U.S. population. Hispanics, which isn't a race, it's more than an ethnicity, represent maybe 15%. I mean, when you add it all up, I mean, it's still very, very disproportionately white. And again, so is the Democratic Party. That's why we as Native people, we experience racism from the left and the right, but so do other people. So do black people. Obama didn't do anything particularly special for black people. And he actually, raised the bar when it came to, or actually lowered the bar, I guess you would say, when it came to killing people of color. The amount of people that died of drone strikes and and the like. I mean, this is something that the amount of people who were deported was at an all-time high with Barack Obama. So this is what I'm kind of talking about. How the system is skewed towards that favor, and I haven't even gotten into things like economy, and that's what I'm going to talk in the second half of the show, because not only does democracy promote racism and populism, but the so-called lauded free market capital system of the United States, it does the same thing. Look, power begets power. And while white people were for a long time were not the majority of the United States, and in fact, they ruled entire continents like Africa, being a stark minority of the people. But see, they never promoted democracy then. They had their racist laws and their racist policies in place, and so they ruled with might. They ruled with power and and through threat of death. That's how these groups became powerful enough to begin to become the majority. And then once they become the majority, then we can talk about democracy. We can talk about how great democracy is. The founding fathers of the United States, they didn't applaud democracy. In fact, many of them thought that democracy would always dwindle down to mob rule. They were afraid that if the people, the broad populace controlled the country, the government, that they would break the treasury. They were concerned about this. It's actually part of the reason that some of them didn't even want a standing army, because they were afraid of what populism within a standing army would create. I mean, this is the fear, because when the founding fathers talked about tyranny, they weren't just talking about the tyranny of a monarch. They were talking about the tyranny of a mob. So this is what people have to understand. So when I listen to all of this, all of this clamor about an attack on democracy, well, let's also be wary of who was doing the attacking, because 74 plus million people voted for Donald Trump. And I'm not saying that 74 million people still support Donald Trump, but they may. I mean, even with what transpired last week, there hasn't been a wholesale exodus of people from Donald Trump. It still goes right along party lines. The same people who supported him before this attack on the Capitol, this mob on the riot at the Capitol, support him to this day. Many of them. Some of them are trying to distance themselves only because of political expediency. But we'll talk about that when we come back to. All right, this is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. We'll take a break and we'll be right back after this. All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Oh, so there was an attack on our democracy. That's what Americans are saying. That's what politicians are saying. The crazy part is they're also saying that this was all about trying to disrupt a democratic election. Well, the irony is that what this mob was trying to disrupt was not just the election, but the process that actually, even if it is a formality, that would essentially grant the presidency to Joe Biden, which was the Congress getting together to essentially tally up the Electoral College votes, because that's how the president is really determined, by the Electoral College votes. The general election is supposed to guide those Electoral College votes, and look, we can have a big discussion on how democratic the system is. Look, you've got 50 states with 50 different sets of rules on how elections take place. Everything from how the primaries. I mean, are primaries even an election? That's even a debate. I mean, yes, people vote, but the parties get to not even the state, but the parties get to determine who gets to vote in their primaries. I mean, it's really kind of a skewed system. So by the time you get to a general election, you've already had, less than the will of the people determining who's going to be the party nominations, the nominees. I mean, we saw a debacle both times. Bernie Sanders ran for the Democratic nod. The first time, it got pretty well exposed on how the whole primary system was geared to eliminate. The system was geared to eliminate Bernie Sanders, and we could argue the same thing happened in this last race where he has to concede to Joe Biden. So, I mean, how democratic the elections are, that's a whole nother debate. But it is what it is. The fact that you had both the president of the United States and a certain number of Republican senators and a larger number of Republican congressmen that wanted to overturn the results of the election and prohibit the electoral college votes from being cast in accordance to the system that has been in place is kind of absurd. But when I keep hearing it, just reiterated over and over and over again that it was an attack on the democracy, that at some point somebody needs to school people on what democracy really means. And again, when you have a situation that when it comes to these elections, the majority rules over the minority, that does spill over into the idea into the racial majority ruling over the racial minority. Now, I'm not promoting this idea that race is even a legitimate measure of a person or a characteristic, but racism is real, even if race isn't. And we see it again. Walk into any prison. You walk into the difference in the countryside versus the urban environment. You can see how people are distributed across the landscape. And the crazy part is you even in really, really democratic states, if you look at the state by geography, there is no question that geographically, the vast majority of the United States geographically is Republican. And now, of course, that we don't measure space, right? We measure human beings, people. But because the concentration of people in the cities are enough to overcome the rural populations that are very, very white, you look at any state. I mean, we're looking at Georgia in this last election. I mean, it was right around those three cities that enough people cast ballots to overcome all of the red areas of Georgia. And that's not just true in some places like Georgia. Look at New York State. Look at California, Washington, Oregon. And it kind of shows you that the way people are distributed are uneven. And then because of things, like I said, gerrymandering and the idea that rural states get two senators, even while more populous states get two senators, that it deviates. I mean, it actually undermines this whole concept of democracy. Now, and of course, the concept of democracy does favor the majority, which is oftentimes going to be at the expense of the minority, and even if it's people who are considered the minority by the color of their skin. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about economies. I listened even today. I listened to a show on NPR, and I heard one of these right-wing policymaker or consultants or whatever suggest that income disparity does not hurt the poor or the middle class. Let me say it again. He said the income disparity. So the fact that the rich got richer and the poor got poorer doesn't hurt the poor or the middle class. He said there's no evidence to suggest that. Of course, there's plenty of evidence it is, but he says it, and he says it on NPR. And to the extent it gets challenged, it isn't challenged with the proportionate amount of force. He actually went on to say that income disparity, so when you have a larger disparity, when you have the rich richer and the poor poorer, it's actually a sign of economic growth and economic expansion. Well, that might be true because economic growth comes at the expense of poor people and the middle class, and it benefits the wealthy elite the most. So this gets into what the United States wants to promote as their free market system, and you hear this a lot from the Republicans, but you hear it from Democrats as well. This is why they want to cast out this idea of socialism and try to demonize socialism, because they want to promote their free market that makes the rich richer, and they want to promote their capitalist system that continues to create a larger and larger accumulation of wealth amongst the very few. I listened to some of the hearings that are going on, even as I'm speaking, about impeaching Donald Trump for his role in the attack on the Capitol. And I listened to one of these Republican hacks get up there and talk about the great accomplishments that Trump achieved, including his tax cut, which was for the rich. I mean, there was very little advantage certainly to the poor or to the middle class when it comes to Trump's tax cut. It benefited. It created a huge deficit, and it benefited the rich. So again, it added to that income disparity. And then they want to brag about how great the economy was doing. That's only if you measure it in terms of the Wall Street, the stock market, or unemployment. Look, I've said this before on the show. All of the numbers that people attribute to the unemployment rate are completely bogus. I mean, if you want to understand what the real employment rate is in the United States, then you measure the entire adult population, working age of population, and set that against how many people have jobs. That's the unemployment rate. And it is not 7%. It's not 8%. It's not 9% or 13% like black people are experiencing. It is much higher than that, because the unemployment rate you hear in the news is only counting those who are unemployed, who are still seeking employment through the system, that are registering as unemployed, whether they can receive benefits or not. It only goes back, I think, the last 90 days. So if you stop looking for a job or stop demonstrating that you're looking for a job, then you aren't even counted as unemployed. So if you lost your job a year ago and still haven't been able to get a job, you're not considered unemployed. At least not in terms of those rates. And of course, through all of this pandemic, this global pandemic, and of course more seriously, the country that's managed this thing the worst has been the United States. Highest number of deaths, highest number of cases. It has been managed so poorly by the United States. No country has failed as miserably as the United States has when it comes to managing COVID-19. But you know what? The rich still got richer. Yeah, some of them died, but they still got richer. And the poor got poorer. The people who were most adversely affected. And of course, when you wanted to talk about things like stimulus checks or supplemental unemployment benefits, all those rich people said, well, we can't have poor people getting more money during this COVID-19 shutdown. We can't have them making more money while they're not employed than when they're employed. They were so concerned about the few people, and it is relatively few compared to the amount of people who would actually make less money on unemployment, which is the overwhelming majority. But they're so concerned that a few, again, predominantly people of color, might be making more money not working than working, that all these white guys, in the Republican Party said, no, we can't have that. And there were some people in the Democratic side too. So this is the crazy system that exists in the United States. And it's anti-democratic. Look, you can see over and over and over again times when the vast majority, and I don't mean just the bare majority, the barely majority. I'm talking about the overwhelming majority of people wanted some piece of legislation changed, like stronger background checks after the Newtown massacres. It was something like 80% of the U.S. population, and granted, these are polls, but a majority of senators and congressmen wanted some changes too, but not a supermajority. They couldn't get 60 votes in the Senate to pass it. So nothing changed. After a bunch of first graders got killed with an AR-15, there was no legislative action to address the issue. Didn't matter what the overwhelming majority of the people. So this isn't about democracy. This is about who has the power. And those who have the power want to advance things like gun rights. And they want to advance things like, tax cuts on the rich. They want to make sure that that they protect their interest. Let me get back to talk about the majority a little bit again. Because one of the things that happens with a majority that is oftentimes determined almost by skin color is the fear. I mean, there's white supremacy and there's white privilege, but then there's the other thing that kind of is on that decline, which is white fragility. What you saw demonstrated at the U.S. Capitol last week was white fragility. It was fear that Trump stoked in the American in much of the American population, the ones that support him. They said, "Look, if you don't overturn the election and keep me as president, the country's over." I mean, he literally said these kind of things, that your freedom would disappear, and he was talking to white people. And so a lot of the things that he the racist comments that he's expressed, his misogynist comments that he expressed, all of the things that were deplorable by any measure of humanity, it really was about him playing to his white base. When somebody was killed, by white supremacists, he goes, "Oh, there were fine people on both sides." He couldn't even condemn white supremacists when they killed somebody. And he hasn't really condemned the white supremacists who killed, who were responsible for 6 deaths at the Capitol last week. But what he stoked was this idea of white fragility, that if you don't take a stand, regardless of what the majority, regardless of democracy, or what is perceived democracy, because what happens is if you're white and in control, you can even control the narrative on what is really what the facts are. Did the elections go the right way? Was there fraud? And that's what was spun here. So when you create a large, impassioned majority, even if that majority slips down below 50%, you still have that impassioned mob that is louder, more active, more, more passionate. And they have a power. They have a power that defies the democracy, because they believe that they are right, and they believe that they represent the majority of the people that matter. And again, we got into this whole debate on what a legitimate vote is. Most of the votes that they wanted to see dismissed were votes of people of color. Everything that was done in the U.S. election that would make it easier for people to vote, the Republicans were against. Why? Because they do better. The fewer people to vote, the better it is for Republican. That's the way it works. So what we saw in this mob, this angry mob that assembled at the Capitol, and may assemble again for Inauguration Day, we don't know. But what you saw were people who really believed that they are the majority, and they believe that they are superior. And that other voices don't matter. Look, you saw people that were wearing, Nazi symbols, Camp Auschwitz shirts, carrying the Confederate flag. All of this stuff is about white supremacy, because the majority of Donald Trump's followers, and again, we're getting into this word majority again, the overwhelming majority are white. And when I say overwhelming, I mean, you're lucky to find a black face in most of these crowds. But they're not just white. They're white supremacists, and they feel like it's slipping away. One of the things that attracted them to Donald Trump was the fact that he would speak in these racist terms. They found comfort in that because they felt like their racial superiority that is systemic, not real. Let's be clear. There is no racial superiority, but the system is skewed towards white people. And that's what they fear was slipping away. And see, again, rather than saying, living with the idea that yes, the United States is becoming more racially, diverse. Again, I hate to keep harping on race. I don't mind harping on racism, but if you look at the skin color, it's becoming more and more diverse. But like I said, even the Democratic Party is still predominantly white. It's still more white people than they can only attribute a certain percentage of the black vote that'll help swing an election. But it's I always say this about Native people who run in elections. They aren't going to get elected by Native people. And the same thing goes for a black candidate. You're not going to get elected by black people. Those black people might help, but you need white people to vote for you. You're not going to win. I don't care where you run for office. If you don't get white people to vote for you, you're not going to win an election. And it doesn't matter how good you are. It doesn't matter how sweet you are. It doesn't matter how squeaky clean you are. It doesn't matter how righteous you are. If you don't get white people to vote for you, you're not going to win an election. White people still control pretty much every institution and every system in the United States. And I'm not saying that people of color aren't making it into those systems, but they're still very, very small in numbers compared to the overwhelming majority of white people. And the problem is that the people of color who make it into those systems, they've had to play the white man's game so much to get there. And that's why when I'm critical of somebody like Barack Obama, it's because he's a black guy, mother's white, father's black, but he had to endear himself to a lot of white people to get there, and he had promises to fulfill. He had people he had to look after, and I'm not saying that of somebody like Warnock who just won in Georgia. I'd hope to see, but I would like to see when a black man gets into a position to affect change, that it actually affects change. And look, and even the Native people who have run for Congress, and there are 5 still. There are 5 Native Congress people. 5. 2 of them are Democrats, and one's going to be gone because she's going to become the Interior Secretary, and 3 of them are Republicans. And they don't necessarily advance, and now there'll only be 1 Democrat, but she represents Kansas. She doesn't represent the overwhelming majority of Native people. And it's hard to imagine that somebody who has been through that system, that is, either been military and they're Christian and they're party operatives, when they make it through that system, in fact, you can see it right now, even as Congress was voting on this impeachment thing. You're going to see the Native people vote strictly along party lines. They're not voting, as Native people. They're voting as Democrats and Republicans. That's the system. And what got them there? What got the 2 senators from Oklahoma or the congressman from Oklahoma in there? White people. I mean, Native people didn't get them elected. The Republican congresswoman from, and I'm not talking about Deb Haaland, her name is Harrell or something like that. She's Republican. And, she was actually one of the ones, trying to overturn the election. Because that was the party line. She's a Trumper. Jake and I were talking on the way in here today. And for all of these people, especially Native people, or even anybody of color, anybody who's been oppressed by the United States, how is it that even today there are still people who want to claim to love America and be proud Americans and to be patriotic Americans? At some point, aren't you a little embarrassed? Aren't you a little ashamed of what the United States has become? I mean, I don't know how you don't laugh at what the United States is going through, especially if you've been the victim of all of the things that they're fighting against each other over. Native people have been we are the most marginalized people within the U.S. Borders. We're still the most marginalized people. We've had our populations killed. Our populations didn't just fade away. We didn't just disappear or evaporate one day. We were the victims of a depopulation policy. And depopulation means murder. It means disease. It means sterilization. It means poverty. It means all of those things that are going to reduce the people not only in their stature, but in their numbers and in their affluence, all of that stuff. I mean, we didn't magically become, half of 1% of the U.S. population. This was worked on for centuries. This is what our experience is. So why would Native people be all excited about Deb Haaland being the Interior Secretary, or be so proud, proud of the United States? Where do you get this pride from? I mean, it's incredible. I mean, I hate to say it, but there are Native people who may have participated in that storming of the Capitol, and not for any Native reasons. No, only for Trump reasons. And look, there's a part of me who watched that angry mob go to the Capitol and thinking, yeah, that's about right. That's in the words of Malcolm X, that's the chickens coming home to roost. And that's exactly what that was. And look, I laughed. I mean, can I say I enjoyed it? I don't know that I can say that I enjoyed it, but I found it remarkably hysterical. I mean, I did. As I watched that unfold, and even as I still hear Republicans try to justify it. Oh, no, we condemn violence. No, you didn't. None of you did. You advocated for it. You incited this. And you'll still hear people today, and across Facebook, Twitter, on the floor of Congress, try to compare what took place last week to the riots or to the protests that took place in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. Like there's a comparison to people who are angry about cops killing unarmed people of color. And this lie that Trump really won the election by a landslide. Those people who went to the Capitol last week, they were trying to overturn, their system of government, their system of their election system. That's what they're trying to overturn. They weren't trying to correct an injustice. They're trying to affect an outcome of a system that as flawed as it is something that they would absolutely, they had no problem with Trump being declared the winner of an election that he lost by almost 3 million votes. But let him be declared a loser and one that he loses by 7 million. And these people lost their minds. But those people protesting the Capitol is not the same as any of the people who were pissed off at cops, who were pissed off at death by cop, or pissed off at racial and social and racial inequities. Look, I'm all for taking to the streets and raising hell about unarmed people of color being killed by police officers, and then justified by the systems, by the justice system, by by the so-called checks and balances. These aren't the same thing. Those riots that occurred. And some of those were actually instigated by people trying to be troublemakers, by Proud Boys. I mean, many of those riots were escalated by people who were intent on causing destruction, who were on the right. Anybody trying to suggest that this storming of the Capitol was Antifa or Black Lives Matter, what did they think? A bunch of black people put on whiteface and did this thing? They know it. They know the truth. But again, this is the mentality that exists, and it exists. Part of it is the idea that there was going to be a constant promotion of democracy as something that is always going to be prevailing wisdom and prevailing truth, and it's not. Look, even in a true democracy, with 50% plus one, you've got a dissatisfied and a discontent 50% minus one. That's just a recipe for conflict. And that's the conflict that we're seeing. I want to thank you for listening. You can check us out as a podcast. You can check this out on YouTube, and you can check this out on Facebook. But do check us out. I look for your comments, and you can support us on Patreon. Yahweh.
But you can never walk alone on your way to being free. Will you? Will you? Yeah. But you can never walk alone on your way to being free. Will you? Yeah. Will you? Yeah. Will you? Yeah. But you can never walk alone.
Never walk alone on the way to being free.